ilmiöstä ja ihan lyhyesti muutamalla sanalla esittelen Simon Frithin, joka on todellakin, tai saattaa olla, että ei ole kaikille tuttu, mutta hän on siis brittiläinen populaarimusiikin tutkija, oikeastaan pioneeri, uran uurtaja populaarimusiikin tutkimuksessa. Eli hänen kirjoilleen, joita on täällä nähtävissä, niin perustuu, tai näin väittäisi, että oikeastaan se sellainen populaarimusiikin tutkimus, mitä nyt maailmalla keskimäärin tehdään, niin on aika paljon ammentanut lähtökohtiaan Simonin tekemästä työstä ja niistä näkökulmista, miten hän tarkastelee musiikkikulttuuria, populaarimusiikkikulttuuria laajasti sekä musiikillisena että yhteiskunnallisena ilmiönä. Ja tosiaan tämä luento on tosiaan Kaupunginkirjaston kanssa yhteistyössä järjestetty ja muita järjestäjätahoja on Suomen etnomusikologinen seura ja äänentutkimuksen verkosto sekä T7 eli mistä se lyhennettiin? Tutkivan teatterityön keskus, joo. On vähän myöhäinen iltapäivä, niin kaikki ei pysy mielessä. Mutta tosiaan tervetuloa. And now, shortly in English, my great pleasure is to introduce Emeritus Professor Simon Frith, who is one of the pioneers of popular music studies in academy. And I think quite many people sitting here in this room have read books made by Simon, written by Simon. And they have been very influential. And I think that the popular music research done in Finland has taken much influence from your work. So I'm very happy that you are here. So, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Can everybody hear me if I speak into this mic? For about the last 10 years and ongoing, I've been involved in a research project which is writing the history of live music in Britain since 1950. And in this paper I want to focus on one aspect of this that I found very interesting, which is the rise of a notion, a concept, of a kind of ideology of what I call their do-it-yourself music, which in Britain is normally summed up in the phrase I always use is DIY. Which now, when I knew I wanted to talk about this here, one of the things I then did was to see if I could find out via Google what the Finnish translation of DIY was. And I found this a really interesting process. Most interesting pages in translation terms are ones where they put a number of paragraphs in English, all of which use the term DIY in rather different contexts, and then they give a number of translations in Finnish on the other side. And I went through all those translations and I couldn't find any words in common between the different translations of DIY. There didn't seem to be any like DIYs suddenly appearing or anything like that. And so what I finally concluded was that in this, as in most things, Finnish language is much more sensible than the English language, because it doesn't just have one term for do-it-yourself. It seems to have about 37 different meanings. And one of the things I want to argue is we would be much clearer in British popular music studies if we took the same approach. And so there isn't one thing called DIY music. There are a lot of different aspects of making music which can be called DIY, but they all have different implications and raise different problems. And some of those I want to talk about today. So my starting point then was, why was it that these days, I'm talking particularly now, in both popular music studies literature and in popular journalism, DIY is what I call a praise word. To call something DIY is implicitly to say it's a good thing. It's good music or a good performance or a good way of making music or a good way of selling music. So DIY has become, in a very straightforward way, a rather uncritical term of praise. To call something do-it-yourself to say this is good. And I'll take a recent definition just because it came from a very interesting article about do-it-yourself music on the web, where a young academic called Ellis Jones defines do-it-yourself or DIY music as a cultural form which, following in the footsteps of punk, has historically emphasized autonomous small-scale production, democratic participation, and the building of an alternative distribution network as a meaningful resistance to the consumption of mainstream popular music. And defined like that, you think, what's not to like about that? Sounds wonderful. It ticks all the right boxes. But because I've become somewhat cynical over the years, I'm always suspicious of praise words. And suspicious for various reasons, but the last time I got suspicious like this was looking at the way in which creativity was always described as a good thing. And I became interested in why was it and when was it that people thought it was a good thing to be creative, and what is actually meant by being creative. So I thought I'd apply the same approach to DIY and ask the same questions, which were, first of all, why is DIY music making a good thing? It's always assumed it is, but why? What makes it better than other forms of music making? Secondly, what is actually being described by the term as a matter of practice, rather than simply as an idea? What actually is do-it-yourself music making? And then thirdly, how did the term become an essential element of popular music studies discourse? And in summary, my answers are as follows. First, it isn't necessarily a good thing. Secondly, there are many different examples of DIY music, of which punk is only one strand. And third, the term has actually been used differently by different people at different moments of popular music history. And I'll come back to the first two issues there about whether it's a good thing and why punk has become such a dominant notion of DIY music, and begin by examining a bit more detachedly the history of DIY as a term and how it became applied to music. So from the history of live music that we've been doing, there are two key moments when live music, when the term DIY suddenly became a dominant way in which music, live music was described. The first was in the mid-1950s, and the second was in the mid-1970s. So I'll begin in the mid-1950s. And it was applied particularly to a sort of music that in Britain was called skiffle. I don't know if there was any equivalent of Finnish music, but basically it was a kind of, essentially it was a way of describing elements of rock and roll. It was American country and blues music, folk music, but had been kind of rocked up. And I'll come back to that in a second. But before I get to there, I think it's worth saying that in Britain, as far as I can tell, the term do-it-yourself or DIY, just as a general term, was first used, or at least first made popular by a television programme in the mid-1950s that was on the BBC. And this programme was called Barry Bucknell's Do-It-Yourself. And it was a programme about home improvements. And essentially, it was a programme in which Barry Bucknell gave tips and demonstrated the skills needed for do-it-yourself home improvements, how to paint walls and put up wallpaper, how to box in fireplaces and stair banisters, how to rehang doors and remove skirting boards, etc. So it's all the things that he was encouraging that people who people could do in their own homes for themselves. And this became known as do-it-yourself and remains to this day and a common term in that world, nothing to do with music. Now, I think the popularity and the influence of this programme and why DIY became such a popular term reflected a number of aspects of post-war British life. First of all, the need for home improvement. Following the Second World War, war damage, austerity, a general rundown of people making any sort of investment in housing for the previous 20 years, most people needed their homes to be improved. That was just a sort of necessity. Secondly, and relatedly, there was a great shortage of skilled local craftsmen, as a result of which to get somebody else to do home improvements was incredibly expensive. So there was a kind of incentive to do it for yourself. Thirdly, there was a significant lack of craft skills among the general population. And one of the things I found that was very interesting, that Barry Bucknell's TV programme had a particular appeal to women, because within the household, women were even less likely than men to have been taught such skills at schools. They're more likely to have been taught what in Britain would be called domestic science, cooking, sewing and those sort of skills, rather than having any access to courses in how the electrical system works, or how you could rewire anything, or what's the best way of hanging wallpaper and so on. So women in particular seem to have formed a significant chunk of the Barry Bucknell audience, and a significant chunk of the people who got involved in doing this do-it-yourself. Now, I just want to finally, this might seem a digression, but you'll see it's relevant, I hope, later, that there are a number of things to note about this notion of DIY. First of all, the Barry Bucknell programme provided a very standardised account of what a home improvement was. In other words, what sort of thing improved a home. And famously, and this became a sort of joke later on, everybody who watched Barry Bucknell immediately blocked in their open fireplaces. because it stopped drafts and it was, you know, it saved on fuel and everything else. And they boxed in that banisters. Houses might have banisters with I don't know what you call things, you know, like spaces and rods, and they boxed those in because they're much easier to clean. So these sort of things became very standardised in the ways in which homes are improved. So this was not about design or thinking about how to make your house look beautiful. It was a very functional craft of how to achieve certain ends for the house, in this very standardised sort of way of doing it. Second point to make is that the results were often very, very badly done. Do it yourself was no guarantee of good work. In fact, it's probably a guarantee of not very good work. People didn't have the skills, and they didn't necessarily have the money to buy the best sort of materials, etc., etc. And this means that certainly for the next generation, if you talked about moving to a house where there'd been a real DIY job, what it meant was the house was terrible and you had to start all over again. So there was no notion of DIY being a good thing. There was a notion that DIY was a necessity, and you could see why people did it. But famously, when the next generation of people moved into houses done like this, the first thing they did is rip out everything that the DIY people had put in and start again. And I certainly lived in houses where you could see it was DIY, because there'd be people who put things up around the ceiling and there'd be gaps from one corner to another, but they hadn't quite got enough material, and the door knobs opened the wrong way around, which was extremely psychologically peculiar. And so all sorts of things like that. So you kind of took it for granted that DIY meant not necessarily shoddy work, but certainly work that was eccentric and not very livable with, and certainly didn't show anything in the way of good decorative taste. So the first point I'm making is it's worth noting that when DIY started being used, although it had sort of positive connotations encouraging people to do things that were good things to do, it didn't really carry very positive connotations of thinking necessarily DIY work was a good thing. And I think that's both worth bearing in mind when we come to the first use of DIY as a term in popular music history. And as I say, this was in reference to the music called skiffle. So this is a very interesting historical period. In the mid to late 1950s and into the 1960s, a remarkable number of young people, mostly boys, mostly early school leavers, that is not people who went to university or became students, began to make music for themselves, even though they had no formal musical qualifications, were often using homemade or home-adapted musical instruments, and getting together with other musicians who had equal lack of skills, and somehow feeling that by playing together for a few weeks sometimes they could then stand up on stage and play to other people. And this is actually, you know, a very interesting phenomenon, that people had that sort of confidence that they could do it themselves in that way. And this do-it-yourself music, as I say, became essentially a part of what early British rock and roll was. And this music was certainly the starting point for almost all Britain's youth pop stars, from Cliff Richard and the Shadows to the Beatles. If you look at their history, they would have started out playing in skiffle bands, playing in these sort of do-it-yourself, coming together youth groups. And some of these musicians, and skiffle was also a source of some of Britain's most distinguished folk and jazz performers too. It was a very widespread phenomenon. Now, I don't want to go into the details of this here or go through all the acts and so on, but I want to relate how skiffle was thought of to Barry Bucknell's home improvement DIY. So I'll just note the following points. First of all, one could say this do-it-yourself music in the mid to late 1950s was necessary, because otherwise live music, rock and roll, was not available. If you didn't do it yourself, there was nobody else who was going to do it for you. There were no concerts that you could go to and see this music. For a number of reasons, to do with musicians' union rules on not allowing American musicians to come and play in Britain, which ruled out a lot of rock and roll performers from coming. The fact that this music was seen as a gimmick and was most despised by professional musicians, and therefore they weren't particularly interested in playing it. School music teachers, on the whole, didn't approve of this sort of music making, thought it was a degrading sort of music, and there are good stories about musicians, school teachers despairing of pupils they thought were good musicians when they discovered they were playing rock and roll and thought they'd given up on what could have been their musical talents. So there was a general feeling that that this sort of music had to be made for yourself, and also in terms of how you made it. Another thing which I didn't really realise till studying this is that there was also a great shortage of musical instruments. Because of the post-war economic situation, Britain had particularly bans on certain sorts of imports and the use of currency, so it was extremely hard to get American guitars, for example. Extremely hard to get even German-made imitation American guitars. So people, in some senses, did have to make their own instruments in one way or another. So that sort of element of do-it-yourselfness was, again, a necessity which echoes the necessity of home improvement when you couldn't afford a craftsman. The second point to make is that skiffle was indeed a very standardised form of music. It was a model that was based on a basic US, what was seen as a kind of US rock and roll lineup, voice, guitar, bass, some sort of rhythm instrument, which in the early days was probably a washboard because it was easy to make or play, rather than a drum kit, which was more expensive. So it was a very standardised form of music. It wasn't particularly seen anywhere as a form of individual expression. Thirdly, and this is important, it was not necessarily of very good quality. Those of the few, if there's anybody here as old as I am, you probably never listened to mid-50s and mid-50s British skiffle groups, but most of them were terrible for very good reason. I mean, they didn't have any musical skills, they didn't have very good instruments, they weren't recorded very well. That wasn't really what they were about. So on the whole, UK rock and rollers of that generation, and I think this is probably true across the whole of Western Europe, were certainly thought of as a joke by American audiences, for example. You know, the notion that Cliff Richard and the Shadows could be a big group was very strange to Americans, as I'll talk to later on. You know, they were clearly seen as being imitative, doing it yourself American music, because you couldn't make the real thing. And so essentially you could say that skiffle bands were cover bands. They were bands trying to make American music because they couldn't get direct access to American music. In a different set of arguments for when they hear, I think this is the great reason why British popular music became so good, because it wasn't dominated by Americans, and British acts did have to eventually work things out for themselves. But certainly this early do-it-yourself music was not valued even by British audiences when rock came along. So I think what's important about this DIY music is it became very important for British popular music industry as a kind of reworking of what it meant to be an amateur musician. Because clearly these kids were amateurs, but they weren't quite like amateur musicians as people knew them then. First of all, they were clearly self-taught in the sense that, I mean, they were taught, and I won't go into this here, but they were not being prepared for a musical career through any sort of obvious apprenticeship. You know, joining a band, joining an established band, for example, and working your way up as jazz musicians would, or through any sort of qualification system, getting particular grades in the musical instrument or taking certain sorts of lessons. So they were self-taught in the sense they were outside the normal musical establishment. Equally, the early skiffle bands were not initially promoted or created or sponsored by the existing music industry. They were set themselves up quite outside how the music industry worked, even though the music entrepreneurs very quickly emerged to exploit them when they saw that there was a possible popularity that they could build. So on the one hand, these musicians were by necessity amateurs. On the other hand, it's equally important to stress that this music making was not a hobby. These musicians weren't doing it just because it was fun. They very specifically, and this is very clear in all the interviews and people's memoirs you can read, wanted careers, wanted audiences, and wanted to have a public presence. And the point of this sort of do-it-yourself, in a sense, was that these people saw American stars making a certain sort of music, and they wanted to be stars like that. They didn't want to just play for fun. That sort of music, they actually wanted to be stars. They had a sort of ambition, which put them outside normal sort of notion of an amateur. They wanted to become professional, one could say. So this was, in summary, this was music making by amateurs who had the commitment, purpose and commercial ambitions of professionals. And what made them different from other musicians who had something of a similar career, like in jazz and folk, was that this was music rooted in youth culture. And one of the aspects of this, which is something that irritated greatly other professional musicians, was that in as far as these musicians had a career, the career seemed to work very quickly. There are a lot of steps they didn't have to go through. You know, you'd have famous stories of people who were playing in the school, in a school end of term concert one week, and 3 weeks later would be, playing on the national stage because they'd appear on television. So all these bands like Cliff Richard and the much more lesser known ones went very rapidly from an amateur status to a kind of entertainer status without going through any of the normal steps that a professional career would take, and I'll come back to that. So that was the first time DIY was used, and it was a term that was used very much for this particular stage of skiffle. By the time the Beatles came along and started becoming popular, no one ever referred to the Beatles as DIY music. They were, in a sense, professional from very early on once they went and started playing in Germany. And so DIY was a term that went into abeyance. As far as we can say, it was hardly used after that, until we get to the mid-1970s and the emergence of punk. Now, I just want to quote you a review that Caroline Coon wrote for Melody Maker in one of the most famous early punk performances, which was the 100 Club's Punk Rock Festival held on the nights of September the 20th and 21st, 1976. Caroline Coon wrote in her review, "Do it yourself could be the motto down at the 100 Club. Everyone wants to get in on the act, everyone can." This show was the show in which Subway Sect and Susie and the Banshees, who had been fans hanging around the Sex Pistols, played their first ever gigs in instantly patched together bands. Essentially, they got together on the floor and decided to get up on stage and play. It was even quicker than skiffle bands in terms of making the move from wanting to playing in public. As Caroline Coon wrote, if the punk rock scene has anything to offer young people, then it's the opportunity to get up and experience the reality of their wildest stage-struck dreams, a view subsequently confirmed by many punk and post-punk musicians, such as the Fall's Marky Smith, who remembers going to the second Sex Pistol gig in Manchester in also 1976. He writes, "I saw the Buzzcocks and I thought I better form a group, I can do better than that." And the Fire Engines' Davey Henderson, who went to see the Clash tour in Edinburgh in 1977, remembers the Slits were so alien and the Subway Sect were one of the scariest things I had seen, like a bizarre Twilight Zone. Then I knew I could be in a group and do exactly what I wanted. So punk was very much organised around this notion that people were inspired to do it for themselves by watching the very earliest punk bands. Now, clearly, this was a very different context than skiffle. It was a context of what was thought of as corporate or progressive rock, large-scale, technologically complex, very expensive acts going on in big stadium or big halls in Britain, and a movement to reclaim what was seen as the true kind of authentic rock and roll from this corporate behemoth. So first of all in pub rock bands, and then secondly by punk groups. So the question becomes, what was actually being reclaimed here? What was it that people thought had been lost by the emergence of rock, and they could gain by going back to rock and roll? And I think there's just a few things very schematically. First of all, one of the things that comes out very clearly is that punk was seen as breaking down the distinction between being a performer and being a listener. Tracy Thorn, who very early on when she was still at school formed a female trio called the Marine Girls and went on to be in Everything But the Girl, writes in her memoirs, "It was punk groups in general, like no other groups before them, that inspired the conviction and desire to take part in what was happening rather than simply to watch and listen. Perhaps previous bands had inspired those with genuine musical talents to buy instruments, start practicing and dream of one day being good enough to perform. But after 1977, it seemed there was no need to fanny around, wasting time on things like practicing or honing your craft. You could just buy an instrument, get together with anyone else who had one, and go out and do a gig. Right now, you didn't want or need anyone's help. The whole point was to do it yourself, and that's just what we did." So there was that notion that anybody could be a musician. If you were interested in music as a music fan, then you could be a musician. The second thing was that punk was partly involved in the process of demystifying the music-making process, the actual, what you might call the kind of mysteries of the craft of being a rock musician. Again, Tracy Thorn's got a funny story when the Marine Girls get their first gig, which is actually at the Lyceum in London, a fairly major theatre. And they're being booked as a support act for the Scottish band Orange Juice. And they roll up at 4 o'clock and they find the whole of the road crew and the promoters in a state of rage and frustration, saying, "Why aren't you were supposed to be here for the sound check?" And they say, "What's a sound check?" And they had absolutely no idea what a sound check was, because they knew absolutely nothing about how the music world worked. They just knew they wanted to be in it. And you get a lot of these stories that a kind of sense that the music world was keeping people out by having these kind of secrets about how you made music, and they were just ignoring that and just doing it. But more importantly than that, in some ways, is the notion also of demystifying music production and marketing process. And one of the key aspects of punk, and particularly post-punk, was the notion that you could do these things for yourself too. So the Marine Girls, for example, put together, even before they'd done a gig, put together an album music on cassette, which was quite important in this period. They advertised the cassettes for sale, took out a very small ad in NME and also in fanzines, and said they were available by mail order. And the mail order was to obviously her home. She was still at school, still living at home. And they started getting people writing in and asking for records, and then they got a letter from a German fanzine wanting to interview them, and then a letter from a Dutch company wanting to have hundreds of cassettes that they could distribute in Europe. So in a sense, just by doing it themselves, they found they got themselves into a production system without having to go near any normal sort of record company. And I think it's this aspect of punk, more than the actual music making, that is the origins of Ellis Jones' account of DIY as democratic participation, autonomous small-scale production, resistance to the consumption of mainstream culture and so on. It was a kind of the demystification or the deconstruction of how the record industry worked that particularly attracted academics. It seemed like a good thing to do. And what I just want to conclude before although ideologically that makes sense, in practice, if you look at the history of punk, it doesn't make very much sense. Punk quickly turned out to be another version of being a star, having a career, developing a band as a brand, using all the same sort of marketing strategies and developing new marketing strategies, just as the alternative models of music production, independent record labels, were quickly integrated into the music business, rather than being in any sense resistant to them. So in many ways, punk created an ideology of DIY, rather than necessarily, in its own history, demonstrating how DIY culture could work. Now, what I want to suggest next is that this means that what you get left within popular music discourse is an ideology of DIY, which then gets applied in a rather erratic way to different sorts of music. So that in one sense, you could say that every new musical movement that could demonstrate some elements of this sort of ideology could claim itself as DIY music and be praised accordingly. So just to give some examples, rave culture in the 80s, the development of illegal parties and so on, became called DIY, even though very quickly it was clear that it actually was a much better expression of the new Thatcherite government's interest in entrepreneurship, when you look at the career of the people who set up those raves. Pirate radio, which was eventually absorbed into BBC and commercial radio, was again seen as very significant DIY. Later generations, bedroom bands using new digital technology. There was a famous hit in Britain in 1997 called Your Woman by White Town that was made entirely in somebody's bedroom, released, cut everything, recorded from that. Got a huge amount of publicity. That's how significant this was. The person who made that record never had another hit. And it didn't really make any difference to how electronic music was marketed at all. But each of these things became symbolically important, as today are homemade videos posted on YouTube, notion that musicians can now have direct contact with self-postings via social media, and so on and so forth. So I'm rather skipping over things here, but what interests me more here is not that some of these activities in popular music get labelled DIY in a somewhat suspect way. What I'm more interested in is things that are clearly are DIY, but aren't labelled as such. In other words, examples of people making music for themselves, which somehow don't seem to come under the DIY label. But again, the easiest thing is just to read out some obvious ones. Well, first of all, folk music of all kinds. It's never been called DIY. Brass bands, which are clearly do-it-yourself form of music, and in quite elaborate ways, don't usually get called DIY. Amateur music making generally, avant-garde music like musicians, collectors, and so on. And one for me that I always think is interesting is tribute bands, where you could say bands are making Pink Floyd albums for themselves, performances for themselves, because Pink Floyd doesn't do it anymore. So that's a very kind of classic sort of DIY, but not how we think about them. But the two, just to pause slightly on, because they happen to be in the period I've just been looking at, and I was amused by how close they were. The first is the early music movement. I don't know, in Britain, the early music movement, the development of a way of looking at Baroque and pre-Baroque classical music and then trying to play it on what was seen as authentic musical instruments and using historical knowledge about how those instruments would have been played, to play them as in some sort of authentic historical way, also emerged in the same sort of period as punk, interestingly enough. So that the first professional freelance orchestra in early music, the Academy of Ancient Music and the English Consort, were both launched in 1973. The Early Music Journal was launched by Oxford University Press in 1973 as well. The Early Music Centre opened in 1976. York's first Early Music Festival was staged in 1977. And the National Early Music Association was set up in 1978. So early music emerged clearly as a kind of institutional form. But the point to stress here is that this came out of what Nick Wilson calls decades of amateur music making, rooted in the activities of local summer schools, courses, music camps, and in family and household gatherings. As he says, a striking feature of the early music revival, up until and beyond its professionalisation, is the extraordinary contribution made by amateur musicians in respect to performance, in the purchasing, performing and making of early instruments, in performance practice, historical musicology, and the editing of musical works. So it's a kind of classic case of what we would mean by do-it-yourself music making. And we can see the same way in which those early musicians are excluded from existing networks. Such music wasn't being taught. There was not demand for that sort of music in performance. How they had to develop their own kind of ideology and own sort of audience in ways that have amazing funny echoes with the way in which sociologists have analysed punk music networks. And even, which surprised me somewhat, that early music also pioneered what you might call DIY record making. So these days we're very familiar with orchestras having their own record labels, but that actually first happened for an early music organisation. I think it was the Gothic Voices very early on, and I can't remember the group. I'll skip over this, but one of the early music groups formed its own label simply to issue its own records, which it then sold at gigs, very much a model that 20 years ahead of the time in both classical music and in some ways in popular music. So there, out of a completely different world, you can see a form of DIY music making that doesn't get thought of like that. The other one I want to mention is Black British music. And the interesting thing about Black British music is the reason why Black British musicians had to do it themselves is because they were excluded from the record industry. They were excluded from the sense that record companies were not particularly interested in signing them up. They found it very difficult to develop venues because police would move in and close them down, or rather to go to venues. And so you get a number of very specific do-it-yourself activities in terms of creating certain sorts of musical spaces, developing sound systems as a way of playing the right sort of music. And again, there was a particular form of, within reggae, or within Black British music, called Lovers Rock, which actually pioneers the whole development of what we think of as independent record labels and was the inspiration for Drift Travis, who then formed Rough Trade, following exactly their model. So again, there's a kind of history of DIY that's left out of most ways in which DIY is talked about. So just to finish off, I want to say something about thinking about the kind of complication of DIY, what this means in analytic terms. And I just want to end with 3 or 4 kind of issues that I think are interesting to think about. The first is the nature of the musical career. How do people have musical careers? And the first point to make here is that when every musician's career starts, it involves some kind of do-it-yourself. That's what they're doing. They're doing it for themselves. They've got nothing else to do. That's how it starts. So all musicians, at the beginning, could be said to be starting from this position. And I think it's interesting that in popular music forms, certainly, and probably for most classical musicians, if you look at people's lifetime career structure, and I don't know how many of you here are musicians, and I'm sure you recognise this, you can say it follows this sort of pattern. You begin as an amateur. You then become a semi-professional when you start getting paid jobs, but not enough to give up on your day job. Then, if you're lucky, you become a professional. And then at a certain stage, the audience or the record company or somebody loses interest, and you find you start having to take other jobs besides music jobs to make a living, and you become semi-professional again. And then you end up as an amateur, because no one will pay you at all, but you're still interested in playing. And certainly where we live in Hexham, you can see this happening both in the kind of classical world, that people who come out of being full-time professional orchestral musics now play in amateur orchestras. They're either retired or getting other sort of income. And I always find it very amusing that you actually kind of feel you're seeing the same rock bands that started out in a pub, 40 or 50 years ago, now playing in the pub again, having had their record contracts and everything else, but they're still playing the same music in the same pub, and probably getting less of a fee now than they got when they first started out. So it's a common pattern. It's not just that people who are amateurs and then become professionals. Most musicians move in this sort of arc. And it's only some of them who get so much money when they're professionals that they don't have to have the sort of subsequent sort of careers. Having said that, I think it's also to stress the point I made earlier, that this is a career. It can be distinguished from music making as a hobby, with no career attention at all. I mean, you can have music as a hobby, but you're not interested in a career. Whereas I think we're talking about amateurs who are amateurs because it's the beginning of a career, or they would like a career, or that's what they're working towards. So I think in this context, DIY simply refers to one aspect of the process. The initial amateurism, which is not embedded. It's when you start, you're not clearly yet embedded in the career structure. And therefore, in some senses, you have to work out your career moves from yourselves. Now, clearly this is primarily about learning. What musicians need in the beginning is to learn things. And in as far as you can't learn them in established learning institutions, then clearly something which we will call self-teaching is required. Although that actually involves listening to records, meeting other musicians, reading manuals and instructions, getting more or less formal teachers from your instrument, developing in networks and so on. It's not exactly self-taught, it's just a different network of learning processes than going through a conservatory. And I think one of the things that's interesting there historically is that you could say a successful DIY music movement, one of its definitions of success is, ironically, that such learning institutions were then established. So I think musicians in the 1950s and the early 1960s will be staggered to know you can now go to school and study how to be a rock musician. And that virtually all jazz musicians these days are jazz musicians because they've been to jazz, studied jazz at college. And so the learning processes that weren't there then are there now. And that's equally true, obviously, of traditional music or early music. So in that sense, you could say that DIY is a kind of temporary phenomenon, or a phenomenon that's interesting historically, but it doesn't establish a kind of permanent way of music making. The second point to make goes back to what I said about black music and the notion that people might have to do it yourself because you're being excluded from music making activities or opportunities. And certainly there are elements of this in punk, particularly with problems of finding live venues to play in, black music as we've talked about. But we can talk about other sorts of music which are not normally thought of as respectable in this context, like neo-Nazi music, which could be seen as a kind of ultimate DIY music, because people in those sort of fascist groups are certainly excluded from any straightforward venues, review process, institutional process, and so on. And then you can talk about other sorts of exclusion, which often, again, are not often talked about this, but are not irrelevant, which is the exclusion of women for a period from classical orchestras. And particularly, it's interesting, one of the most important aspects of punk was that this notion that anybody could do it. For the first time ever, women thought that themselves, like Tracy Thorn, like the band like Slits, to quote a lot of other women's bands, suddenly saw there was no reason why they shouldn't make this sort of music. It wasn't just something the boys did. Rather depressingly, as punk got institutionalised, opportunities for women seemed to go down again, and the statistical evidence suggests there was a burst of women players in rock in Britain in the mid-70s to mid-80s, but then the numbers have declined again since then, in rock music anyway. But again, this is not really a matter of politics or democratic participation. It could also be understood in more orthodox economic terms as being gaps in the market failures, providing economic opportunities for innovators, particularly in terms of the DIY music business. And so there's actually a very thin line between DIY and what you might call the ideology of self-help or entrepreneurialism. Like post-punk indie labels are not particularly alternative in economic terms. And the development of raves into the whole of the kind of electronic music dance culture a very profitable industry, again suggests that it's not simply about DIY in some sort of ideological sense. The third point is that one of the key aspects of DIY seems to be the ideology of, as I've mentioned, getting rid of the distinction between musicians and audience, and developing a sense of community, learning on the job, kind of unmediated communication and so on. Again, I think it's worth stressing that that sort of notion of what makes an ideal performance makes certain assumptions. One, I think by definition, it has to be small-scale performance. It has to involve a small audience, people who know each other. So it's an audience that, yes, indeed, is significant at the beginning of the career. It becomes problematic if you want to develop a career. So obviously, for all musicians, their initial steps in their career are necessary on this small communal scale. And it's quite interesting that it becomes clear in both interviews I've done and in musicians' memoirs that for many musicians, this notion of this sort of communitarian, small-scale performance to an audience who's engaged in the process remains their ideal musical experience. And many famous rock stars will say, of course, it was best when I could only play when I played in small clubs. You know, everything changed when I had to start playing in stadia. But this is not describing a kind of ideological change, it's describing what you might call an economic necessity if you're going to have a career. I think it's most obvious, not so much to do with size or to do with place. A local band eventually has to move out of the locality if it's going to make a living. And moving out of the locality immediately means it's addressing a different sort of audience with a different sort of knowledge, different sort of community. The whole problem of touring, which is essential to the music economy. So you could say that even here, a DIY ideology is describing something that eventually has to stop being DIY, just as anti-commerce has to become a different kind of commerce rather than simply becoming non-commercial. And then finally, clearly there is a more explicit, what you might call political ideology of DIY, and this is the aspect of it being called anti-mainstream. And you can, and again in British live music history, you can point to various things where what was involved was clearly political. The illegal free festivals that were eventually closed down by the police and politicians in the late 60s and 1970s. The illegal warehouse parties that prefigured rave and mostly involved black promoters in the mid-80s. Pirate radio, which were closed down by broadcasting authorities. So clearly there are sort of DIY things that are political, but they tend not to survive. And the ones that are sort of, otherwise they tend to be absorbed, tolerated, and in practice become part of the mainstream. And I think for me, one of the great symbols of this is that the most significant factor in virtually all small-scale do-it-yourself records becoming successful in Britain from around 1968 to 1988 was one person, John Peel, who worked for the BBC. In other words, for bands to make it, they had to get a play on John Peel's radio programme. That was the way in which you kind of reached the people you needed to reach beyond your locality. So John Peel became a kind of key arbiter. And I was very amused to read recently the original press release of my brother's band, Henry Cow, which was an early progressive rock kind of experimental type band. And in the press release they put out their proudest boast that we've had our records played twice on the John Peel show. And I thought, that was exactly what punk bands were saying 10 years later, in 1978. And it gives you a sense of how John Peel, who in one sense is a key establishment figure, becomes the kind of establishment figure who's a resource for non-establishment musicians. But nevertheless, he's not part of a do-it-yourself culture. He's part of the BBC and the BBC marketing. So in practice, the careers of do-it-yourself musicians who are and remain anti-mainstream, commercial mainstream, as Ellis Jones put it, can only do that with the support of state institutions, whether it's educational institutions, multicultural policies, or art subsidies through the arts councils, or there's no other way of doing it. You've got to make a living, you have to have money coming in. And do it yourself can solve the problem of how you make your own money. This sort of problem. So my conclusion of this is that one of the problems of do-it-yourself ideology is that it tends to give a very individualistic aspect of, you know, the whole notion of do-it-yourself tends to deny the role of networks, teaching, investment, collaboration, that are actually necessary parts of music making and that need to be understood. And also have consistently made it an aspect of, actually, of liberal economic arguments about being an entrepreneur. My second issue is that there are major problems of quality control and musical artistic value. As I said at the beginning, the DIY home improvement, it was kind of assumed that that would be not very good work. And there's no reason in music to think otherwise. So the notion of DIY music necessarily being a good thing, it's not because of its DIY-ness if it is. And I always think it's a bit like any parent I know will put their children's art on their fridge. But you would find it very odd if you put somebody else's children's art on your fridge. It would seem that's not why you're putting it there. You're not putting it there because it's good art, you're putting it there because it's your children's art. And similarly, you know, you can go to your child in an amateur in a youth orchestra and very much enjoy the performance. You're unlikely to spend your time going to other youth orchestras and other places and seeing other children, because you don't actually hear very good music, and once your personal investment is not there, then you're not involved. And I think often that's the same with DIY. You can be deeply invested in the process as a participant or whatever, but you're not going to be invested in anybody else's DIY. And this, I think, is a problem for DIY as a movement. So I think DIY refers to craft rather than artistic practice. And in the end, my conclusion of all this, which has got me into arguments with various people, is that I think DIY actually makes better sense in terms of kind of social work than it does in terms of aesthetics. It's about enabling people to make music, which is a good thing to do. It's not about necessarily making good music. So that's where I'll finish.
So I think there's room for discussion, please. Questions? Thank you. Any questions?
Thanks, Simon. This was really inspiring. I mean, it seems to be that you see this DIY music as a way of doing music. Just one way, maybe in time and place, a suitable way of producing music. And you also showed how there are different kinds of modes in doing do-it-yourself music. Some of them want to become stars, some of them just have fun or something like that. I have a good example. My son-in-law, he's a professional musician, but he plays in a kind of a pub band called OTB, which means Olenkoski. OSB. Olenkoski Small Band. It's a local pub in my neighborhood, and a lot of professional musicians living around there. They started to have a kind of a once a month an evening at the pub, and they decided some kind of a musical theme. It could be, you know, European Song Contest songs, Finnish tango, whatever. And they are musicians playing in very different kinds of connections. I mean, some of them are very professional studio musicians, some of them are rock musicians. My son-in-law, he plays in a glam rock band, which is touring around the world all the time. But anyway, once a month they gathered and had a kind of a neighborhood show with hired singers, which were suitable for the theme, and that's been going on for about 10 years. And for them, it's not money, but it's fun. I mean, because they're playing professionally in different connections, this is some kind of area of freedom for them. Just, that's one way of doing it yourself.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, I think
they are already stars, and
I think you could find many examples of this where people have professional musicians who play under certain sort of stresses and requirements and everything, anchor for, and if they're lucky, can find a way of playing other things as well. I mean, famously in the famous Howard Becker's book about jazz musicians, he gives a very clear account of how these jazz musicians, that he was one of them, would go out and do their professional job, which is playing jazz in a club where they're under, they can play for so long, they know what they need to do to please people in the audience, and they get another booking back and so on. And then the moment is over, they go to another completely different pub, which is just for musicians, and then they can jam and play how they really want to play. And they enjoy that. It makes them absolutely no money. It can be useful because it gives them prestige. You get a reputation of being good at things within that. But it's kind of like, it's as if your career has to involve both things. That the professional career seems to remove some of the aspects of musical pleasure that go with not being professional. And so musicians who can achieve that balance, that becomes important. And I suppose what I was saying is that I think that is true of many musicians. I don't think it's possible to pretend that you can have that sort of enjoyable thing as a professional musician. Because once you become a professional musician, all those other things come in that are different from when you're just playing for fun concerts.
I think it's one mode of making music, this do-it-yourself aspect. I mean, it's just it's part of all kinds of music making. I mean, classical musicians are doing that all the time. I mean, many chamber groups are formed or given birth in a way by having fun playing, and then it starts to get more professional.
Yeah, I mean, it raises rather depressing questions about whether you could have fun when you're a professional.
Yeah.
I mean, I was very struck when I was reading rock memoirs. It's very striking that these are all success stories, but they kind of read like someone's deep sense of failure. No one seems happier at the end, even though they got all this money. The accounts of when they were starting and struggling and trying to work out what sort of music they wanted to make and everything, give an account that you feel the musician is much more into and excited by. And then when you get the routine of another million coming in because you've just made an album, you've got to play the same thing every night because the light show doesn't allow you to change a note. This kind of feels slightly depressing. It's odd because you think of it. I thought I was going to read all these sort of rags to riches stories in the traditional, but you kind of feel you're reading a rags to riches stories which is about a deep sense of not having achieved what once upon a time you kind of felt with your body that this is what music was going to be about, and it hasn't been about that. So it does raise questions about professionalism, which in a different research project would be interested in talking to people about more. What are the satisfactions of being a professional musician? What gets lost? Why do they need to go out and play that sort of music? Once and so on.
I found that really interesting that getting from the do-it-yourself to semi-pro to pro and then back, but this discussion that you had, I think it's also the DIY is reinventing yourself. The Finnish audience here knows Anssi Kela, the pop-folk musician who became bored, and then he was the biggest AOR fans in Finland, and then he reinvented his career, and he's also a big star now again, so went again there. So
quite unusual. I think for reasons to do with audiences rather than...
But if we think of big stars, there are bands who have been able to reinvent themselves. I know it's unusual, but it's not impossible, and we have good examples of that as well.
I think in Britain you could say that bands can reinvent themselves until they become very successful. And then they become difficult. It becomes difficult for a band that's become kind of big group to suddenly turn around and say, we're not going to play any of that sort of music. And that's why some people stand out, in some ways, day to day. But, when I was a critic, I used to think there were very few artists that I was going to see who were going to do something that surprised me. Because they always did what they always do, because that's what we did. That's what people have paid money to see. And so it became a kind of an exceptional artist who could... I agree with you, when people are making their way up, they're experimenting and doing lots of things. So it's interesting if you do that. Very interesting.
I don't know if there's too much of them, but I mean, then if we think of these people who can reinvent themselves, I think they are not that, depressed at all in the end.
You do get some example. An interesting example in Britain would be, say, the classical violinist Nigel Kennedy, who seems to now play mostly Polish jazz, and he's still seen and still does classical concerts. He does seem to have been able to, and there are musicians like that, but it is, as I say, I think it's a particularly unusual work.
Yeah, there is also a group of musicians who build their studios in their homes, and they are not necessarily part of any group or musical scene. They create their own music, and it's very cheap nowadays. You don't need a big recording equipment, and you just like spend a few €100 and you can do your own music. And I think and they stay sort of like in their own bubbles in a way, that they don't necessarily have to communicate with the music community. And I think that's a positive notion that can enhance the musical creativity in many ways, even though they don't publish their music through like established labels, recording labels, but they can put it out in YouTube or in Spotify or wherever. And in that sense, that can be like a positive creative force, that you can very easily put your music out, and not necessarily all of this music is good, aesthetically good music, but some of that might be.
I agree with you, and I think this is probably the most, because it's so do-it-yourself. And these days, as you say, you could do everything yourself. The question that interests me about those musicians is the difference between those musicians who do that, well, there's three. Musicians who do that and never release it all, just doing it because it's interesting to do. Then there are musicians who just put it out and somebody listens to it, that's fine. And then there are musicians who put it out because they want people to listen to it. And they want, in a sense, to become known. And I'm quite interested in the relationship between, because I know there are musicians who do that and put out music and they don't seem to care whether anybody listens to it or not. But musicians do like to be listened to. And I think it'd be a bit like a painter. I mean, I'm sure there are lots and lots of painters in the world who sit at home painting and never expect anybody to see their painting. But I think most painters, having painted something, would like somebody else to look at it. So there's still this question about, it goes back to what I was saying about the difference between a hobby and a career. And you could do that as a hobby. But I think if you think of it as a career, you're thinking in some sense of having public communication somehow, getting yourself, whether you like it or not, involved in how you market it, how you make sure people hear it, how you frame it so they listen to it the way you want to listen to it, and so on. So I agree that's very interesting and under-researched in that whole world of music and how different musicians in it work.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, you emphasize the social aspect of DIY music and to the exclusion of some groups. What groups do you see nowadays are excluded from making music, and what kind of changes would you like to see in our society to enable DIY music for everyone?
I think two completely different answers. The first answer, it's a funny answer, is I think one of the great good things about being excluded from music is that you have to do it yourself, and that creates interesting things. So that's why the history of black music in Britain is interesting, because you could say the most successful British young musicians at the moment are coming from a field of grime and other related areas, which historically have been very hard for those musicians to get played on the radio, to get record contracts, without having to adapt their music to sound American. To find venues which were willing to play. So they've created kind of do-it-yourself ways of getting that music made, marketed, sold, which enables them in the end to have actually been able to have careers probably more successful than one of the kind of white rock equivalents. So out of necessity, the exclusion kind of encouraged thinking about ways of using the web in new ways and so on. So that means exclusion can be quite good. But the second half of this is, I think, that anybody who wants to be, I mean, even in punk, once you start looking at it, these people weren't quite as naive and unmusically educated as they were claiming. Even somebody like Tracy Thorn, all these people, when they're writing their memoirs, but between the lines, you find they actually could play the piano a bit, or they had had music lessons at school, or they had some sense of themselves as music as something they could do because it was pleasurable. And I think the biggest block to people in Britain now, Finland is always seen as our model of what a country should be like, but in terms of musical education in Britain, it's getting hard. There are an increasing number of people growing up who have no access to any sort of musical instrument or musical performing opportunities or music teaching. And I think that is a real exclusion, because it means they don't even start from the dream of wanting to be a musician, because it's not seen as something they know anything about. And it's interesting that in the punk period, there's a very good quote I got from Liv Albertine from the Slits, who said she grew up absolutely assuming that rock was something that boys did. She never even thought about being a musician, even though she liked music. She thought to like music was to A, buy a lot of records, and B, have a musician for a boyfriend. And it was only when she saw the Sex Pistols she suddenly thought, well, if they can do that, I can do that too. You know, that it was that which made her think a girl could be a kind of rock, a teen rock musician. So she needed that sense that it was possible. And I think a lot of children are growing up in Britain now without any sense that it was possible. So I think that if I had power, what I'd instantly do is introduce, probably on the Finnish model, free music education, and particularly instrumental education for every child growing up in Britain.
Okay. About the historical side, you already mentioned that the Beatles weren't or are never really considered a do-it-yourself band.
Yeah.
Why do you think that is? Because if you think of the background, like John Lennon was leading the skiffle group,
yeah.
None of the Beatles were really, they weren't professionally trained musicians. And if you think of the club days, the Cavern Club days, it had all the ingredients basically. Why do you think they're not really ever considered to be a do-it-yourself band?
It's a very interesting. The first obvious reason is because they became successful.
too quickly.
Yeah. Well, not too quickly, but in a certain way. But I think there are two really interesting aspects because I've thought about this a lot. The first is that John Lennon went to art school. And so the key difference between the kind of late 60s do-it-yourself rock and roll bands and the mid-60s, that once you get all those blues bands, they'd all been to art school. So they all had a sense of themselves as artists, which the skiffle people certainly didn't. They wanted to be entertained, effectively. John Lennon particularly, and Stuart Sutcliffe and the early Beatles, had a kind of sense they were doing something that was artful. And that very much fed into all of those blues musicians. And interestingly, it was a very strong significance for funk as well, although that's forgotten now. It was also an art school movement. So that's one reason. The other reason is that when the Beatles became successful, they did it through commercial recordings. And so, for me, who knew nothing, didn't grow up in Liverpool, knew nothing about Liverpool local scene, didn't know anything about Beatles playing in Hamburg, I first heard them played on the radio and watched them on TV and watched them becoming part of a kind of media story. So they just became, they didn't seem like doing it themselves, they seemed like part of an interesting part of the industry. So I think that was the other reason for that. So I think it was a mixture of two things. I mean, just to go, I didn't say this here, but one of the things I've always thought funny if you read about musicians from that era, they always say that one of the things they realised at the end of the 1960s is that they had to start writing their own material. They had to write their own songs, and you get people saying, we've been happily doing cover versions for years. Suddenly our manager said, you've got to write your own songs, boys. And they have to go into a room and something, and I think this famously happened to The Who and the Rolling Stones, a whole lot of these bands. But we never really think of songwriting like that as do it yourself. Because it becomes that notion of you're expressing yourself. It's, you're becoming a songwriter. So they kind of emerged when there was a slightly different ideology, I think. I mean, you're right, they actually were a do-it-yourself band. But as a big band, they were in a later period.
Yeah. Thank you.
Do you think it's possible to define a line? A musician, if a musician crosses that line, he or she doesn't anymore do it himself. When does one stop doing it yourself? Is it like money when you start paying your rent with your music, or like stadiums and audiences, or is it like mindset, or?
It's a very good question, and I'm not sure there's one answer. I would say that very broadly, you could say that do-it-yourself is about doing music according to what you want to do. And now there can be lots of motivations for what you want to do, but it's still what you want to do. Or, in this case, what you and your band members want to do. So you're making decisions according to your own notions of what you think sounds good and what you want to sound like or what you want to be. The moment you get involved in a world where other people are involved in that decision making, which could be as early as getting a manager who says if you're going to be successful you've got to do this, or signing to a record label saying that song doesn't really work, you need to add more drums to it to get it on the radio. Once those decisions come like that, then they are entering what you might call a professional world, where people within that world have a power and also have you have a respect for them. They're making decisions that affect what you do because you think it's going to help you. So, you know, the moment when the Beatles started recording with George Martin, even though they were, you know, George Martin in one sense was employed to make them sound the way they wanted to sound, nevertheless they were involved in relationships you couldn't really afford to do yourself. See what I mean? So I think it's difficult to say exactly. So I think it's not exactly to do with money, although that comes into it. It's to do with becoming part of a world that's broader than just your own playing. And that can happen very early on. I mean, quite often bands bring in, it's quite common for bands to have brought in someone who was actually a professional musician or had been, who begins to tell them, well, if you want to make it, you're going to have to do this. And they then have to make a decision whether they're going to listen to it or not. So I think for each, you know, it's an interesting issue when you interview bands, but you do get a sense that they do remember, in a sense, when that line was crossed. And often, as I said earlier, they often look back as that was when everything started going wrong, which is a false memory, but you can see why they think it.
Okay, I think so long. So thank you very much, Simon Frith.